There are moments in the financial world when something appears quiet on the surface, but underneath, pressure is building. Imagine a coiled spring being pushed tighter and tighter year after year. It looks still, it looks weak, but in reality, it's simply waiting. Now imagine that spring is the silver market, because today's conversation revolves around a bold and fascinating idea. Silver is not weak. Silver is trapped. And if the math behind that trap ever begins to unwind, the numbers people start whispering about, $100, $150, even $280, suddenly stop sounding impossible and start sounding like a question worth exploring. Think about how markets behave over long periods of time. Markets are not just charts and prices. They are reflections of supply, demand, human emotion, global systems, and sometimes even structural imbalances. And silver has always been one of the most unusual markets in the entire financial world. Unlike many assets that exist primarily as investments, silver lives two lives at the same time. It is both a monetary metal and an industrial metal. That means it sits at the crossroads of technology, energy, manufacturing, and wealth preservation. When people say silver is weak, they usually point to the price chart. They look at periods where silver seems to lag behind other assets. But price alone doesn't always tell the whole story. Sometimes the real story lives behind the scenes, in inventories, in contracts, in demand trends, and in the strange math of supply versus obligations. Consider this idea. In many commodity markets, the amount of paper claims tied to a resource can become far larger than the physical material available in the system. Futures contracts, derivatives, hedging positions, these are tools that help markets function, but they can also create layers of exposure far above the physical supply itself. Think of it like theater tickets. If a theater has 500 seats, but somehow thousands of tickets are circulating, everything seems fine, until everyone tries to sit down at the same time. Silver has often been described using this exact analogy, not because anyone can predict a specific event, but because the structure of the market invites interesting questions. How much silver actually exists in accessible form? How much is required by industry? How much sits in vaults, ETFs, or long-term holdings? And how many claims exist on top of that metal? The numbers alone are enough to spark curiosity. Global demand for silver has expanded in areas that barely existed 2 decades ago. Solar panels require silver paste. Electric vehicles use silver in electronics. Medical equipment, water purification, advanced circuitry. Silver's unique conductivity makes it extremely difficult to replace. As the modern world becomes more electrified and more technologically dependent, silver quietly sits inside the infrastructure of that transformation. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Silver is rarely mined as the primary metal. Most silver actually comes as a byproduct of mining for other metals like copper, lead, or zinc. That means the supply of silver doesn't always respond directly to rising demand. If a copper mine slows down, silver production can slow down as well. This creates a supply dynamic that behaves very differently from many other commodities. Now imagine this situation: rising industrial demand, limited supply growth, and a complex financial structure layered on top of the physical market. Suddenly the word trapped starts to make more sense, because sometimes a market isn't weak. Sometimes it's simply compressed. Picture a dam holding back an enormous reservoir of water. From the outside, the wall looks calm and unmoving, but behind it, pressure builds slowly, year after year. In markets, pressure can come from many places: tightening supply, expanding demand, or large positions that must eventually unwind. That's why discussions around silver often include fascinating mathematical exercises. Analysts begin looking at ratios, inventories, contract volumes, and delivery systems. They ask questions like, if even a small percentage of paper claims suddenly required physical settlement, how would the system respond? If industrial demand accelerates faster than new supply can arrive, what would the price mechanism need to do to balance the market? Markets always find balance eventually, and the mechanism they use to find balance is price. This doesn't mean dramatic outcomes are guaranteed. Markets can remain compressed far longer than most people expect. History is full of examples where assets traded sideways for years before suddenly repricing when conditions shifted. The important lesson isn't prediction, it's awareness. Silver's story becomes even more fascinating when we zoom out historically. For thousands of years, silver served as money across civilizations. Empires minted coins from it. Trade routes carried it across continents. In fact, for much of human history, silver circulated more widely than gold in everyday commerce. The metal carries a deep legacy in the global financial system. Yet in the modern era, silver occupies a strange position. It is essential for technology, yet often undervalued compared to its historical monetary role. It is globally traded, yet produced in relatively small quantities compared to many industrial commodities. And its market structure can sometimes look more like a complex web of financial instruments than a simple supply and demand story. When people talk about numbers like $280 silver, they are usually not making a promise. They are exploring a theoretical outcome based on structural rebalancing. In many cases, these numbers come from ratio analysis, comparing silver to gold, or comparing the size of the silver market to global liquidity, industrial demand, or historical price relationships. For example, if the gold to silver ratio compresses toward levels seen in earlier eras, silver's price would move dramatically relative to gold. If industrial demand accelerates while supply growth remains constrained, prices could theoretically rise to incentivize new production. These scenarios are mathematical exercises more than forecasts, but they illustrate how powerful the balancing mechanism of markets can be. The deeper lesson here isn't about predicting the next price move. It's about understanding systems. Financial awareness means learning to look beyond headlines and charts. It means asking deeper questions about how markets function. Where does supply come from? What forces drive demand? How do financial instruments interact with physical resources? These are the kinds of questions that build long-term market literacy. And silver provides a fascinating case study. Another way to think about it is through the lens of energy. Every modern economy runs on electricity, data, and connectivity. Silver happens to be one of the most conductive elements on Earth. That property gives it a permanent seat at the table of technological progress. Solar power installations around the world continue expanding as countries seek cleaner energy systems. Each solar panel uses small amounts of silver, but when millions of panels are produced every year, those small amounts become significant. Add electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and medical technologies, and suddenly the metal that once filled ancient coin purses now sits inside the engines of the digital age. When a resource becomes both historically monetary and technologically essential, it occupies a very unusual place in the market ecosystem. So what does all of this mean for the everyday observer? It means the most valuable skill is curiosity. Instead of reacting to every short-term price movement, step back and examine the larger structure. Study how markets connect to real-world industries. Learn how supply chains influence commodities. Explore how historical ratios and cycles have behaved across decades. These perspectives transform market watching from speculation into education. Because the real power of studying markets isn't just identifying opportunities, it's developing a deeper understanding of the systems shaping the world economy. The more you learn about these systems, the more confidently you can interpret headlines, narratives, and market swings. Silver's trap, if we choose to call it that, becomes a powerful metaphor for patience and perspective. Sometimes value sits quietly beneath the surface while attention flows elsewhere. Sometimes the story behind an asset is far more complex than the daily chart suggests. And sometimes the most interesting developments happen slowly, building momentum over years rather than days. When pressure builds in a system, the release doesn't always happen when people expect it, but the mathematics of supply, demand, and human behavior eventually assert themselves. That's why the conversation around silver continues to capture the imagination of analysts, historians, and market observers alike. Not because anyone knows the exact future price, but because the structure of the market raises fascinating questions about what could happen if certain conditions align, and those questions are worth studying. Because the real reward of studying markets isn't a specific price target. It's the mindset you develop along the way: patience, discipline, curiosity, and the ability to think independently. When you look at silver through that lens, the story becomes less about whether the price is strong or weak today. It becomes a story about how complex systems evolve over time. Maybe silver is quiet, maybe it's compressed, maybe it's misunderstood, or maybe it's simply one of the most fascinating examples of how global markets balance themselves when technology, history, and finance all collide. And if that balance ever begins to shift, the math behind it could surprise a lot of people who only watch the surface, because markets have a way of reminding us that what looks calm today can sometimes become tomorrow's most important story. If you found this exploration interesting, take a moment to reflect on the bigger lesson. Markets reward those who stay curious, who study deeply, and who refuse to judge complex systems based only on short-term noise. The silver story is still being written, and understanding the forces behind it is part of becoming a more informed observer of the financial world. If you enjoy deep dives into the hidden mechanics of markets, the history behind money, and the mindset needed to navigate complex economic landscapes, consider liking the video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing for more conversations like this. Because sometimes the most powerful insights begin with a simple realization. The market you thought was weak might actually just be waiting,